are listening to the Metal Command Podcast.
Greetings, everybody. Welcome back to the Metal Command Podcast. Tony here with you, and I'm here to talk about the new Exodus live album, British Disaster, live at the Astoria in London, March 8th, 1989. And this was put out, it was a show they did in London. It's from the Fabolous Disaster tour. So obviously this show took place a long time ago. And I was really excited when I heard that this was coming out. And I think this live album is great. So for me, it takes me back to a time when I was a kid and I was starting to explore the metal scene and I was really getting into bands. Now, for those of you that know me, Exodus is easily my favorite thrash metal band of all time. And obviously they were one of the biggest inspirations for the name of my show. And I probably would not be doing this if bands like Exodus did not exist. And the album Fabolous Disaster is probably a top 5, probably top 3 Exodus album at least for me. And it was actually one of the first Exodus albums that I bought. So I'm going to go back to 1994. Now, Exodus at this point had already broken up. And I had just, it was the middle of the grunge scene. And I was this guy that somehow got into heavy metal during all of that when everybody said it wasn't cool. And I remember the way I would discover bands back then is when I would buy a release by a heavy metal band, I'd look in the thank you list, and they would list bands that they would thank, and I would go around to try to find CDs or albums by those bands. So even though it was the height of the grunge scene and heavy metal was deemed uncool, you could still go into CD stores or music stores and buy heavy metal CDs. They still stocked them. There just weren't a lot of bands around at that point. Like Overkill still existed, obviously. You had Pantera doing their thing. Iron Maiden was still around, obviously, with Blaze Bayley. So you had a lot of bands that were kind of around or not around, but you could still go and buy a band's back catalog. Now, for me, my first time buying an Exodus album, I went into a Best Buy. So if you're from the U.S., from here in the States, Best Buy is a very large retailer. I'm not sure if they have them overseas in Europe or anywhere else, but Best Buy had a huge music section. It's basically an electronics store, but all the electronic stores did have huge sections where they would sell CDs, CD singles. You always had a little spot where they sold imports, and that's where I bought the album Fabolous Disaster. In fact, I actually picked up 3 albums that night. It was the reissue of Bonded by Blood, which, weirdly enough, actually had the Siamese twins on the front of it. I had Fabolous Disaster, and then I bought The Dark by Metal Church and Blessing in Disguise, all in one haul. Now, I was probably 16 years old. I had my first job, and that is where I picked up my first Exodus album. And man, I'll tell you what, I loved Fabolous Disaster, and I still love that album to this day. So listening to this live record brings me back to a time when I was a kid just discovering bands. And at the time, they also had a live album called Good Friendly Violent Fun. It basically consisted of live songs from the Fabolous Disaster album and Pleasures of the Flesh. You didn't have anything from Bonded by Blood on there that was played live that they put on that CD, but it did have a live cover of Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap that Exodus played live someplace. And I believe the live recordings took place after this actual show. So I was really excited, and I'm like, man, they got this live album coming out. I got to check this out, and I'm hoping it sounds good. But to be honest with you, personally, I think this live record sounds great. I think the band sounds great. They sound tight. It's the classic lineup from the Fabolous Disaster and Pleasures of the Flesh album. And, it just brings back a lot of memories on her. There's a very good variety of songs from the first 3 Exodus album. I mean, you do have Last Act of Defiance, Fabolous Disaster, Toxic Waltz, and I'm Like Father, Like Son. We got Verbal Razors, you got Corruption on here. You have Lesson in Violence on there from Bonded by Blood, obviously. Chemical from Pleasures of the Flesh, Piranha. So you have some great songs on here. And it was really cool to listen to Zetro sing those songs, back then compared to kind of how he sings them now. I think back then it was interesting because my actual reissue of the Bonded by Blood album actually had 2 live recordings with Zetro singing them. I don't know where they were recorded at. I never really looked in the liner notes to figure that out. But Zetro does a great job on these songs. Now, obviously, they sound different than Paul Bailoff, but definitely, I think this is a well-mixed and well-done live record. I really, really do. And it was a nice surprise. So I got to be honest with you, folks. If you are into Exodus, if you like that classic lineup from around the Fabolous Disaster time, that time period, for me, I love this record. I think the mix is good. I think it sounds good. It's well recorded. I mean, everything about it, there's nothing to complain about. So I know sometimes when live albums come out, there are some that have been disappointing. The recordings are bad. The mix is bad. That happens. And people, a lot of times people they end up getting like skeptical. Like I remember there was this Metal Church live album from Japan that I bought. It had to be like the late 90s. It was from, I think, the Hanging in the Balance tour, the last tour before when Mike Howe left the first time. And it was one of the worst recorded live records I've ever heard. It looked like somebody just walked up there with like a Walkman cassette recorder and just recorded the concert. It was that bad. And some bands have put out some very piss poor, terrible sounding live records, especially when bands decide, hey, they want to go back to really old shows. Because it always makes me wonder, why did they not put this out after this tour? Now, maybe there were some contractual things. Maybe they didn't feel at the time that they wanted to do it. Maybe the record label just didn't want to do it. Nevertheless, I think this is a great live album. If you are a fan of Exodus, and if you like the Exodus lineup from this era, which pretty much most of you do, you can't go wrong with it. Fabolous Disaster, The Battle of '89, live at the Astoria in London, recorded March 8th, 1989. Phenomenal live album, folks. Sorry, I got a little bit enamored looking at the cover here. But definitely pick it up if you're an Exodus fan. That's all I have for you. Thanks for watching. If you like what you see in here, of course, hit the subscribe button or follow the page. And thanks for watching. Stay metal.